There's actually been a number of very successful prosecutions for homicide when there's no body found ever.
The guilty man flees where no one pursues, while the righteous stands bold as the lion.
And they're pawning the victim's tools at a pawn shop. So
Hello, and welcome to Best Case, Worst Case. This is your host, Jim Clemente, former New York City prosecutor, retired FBI profiler, and currently writer-producer on CBS's Criminal Minds. And with me today, remotely from Philadelphia, is Francie Hakes. How you doing, Francie?
Good, Jim. Hi, how are you?
I'm great, thank you. And also with us is a close friend and colleague, Detective Mannina. How you doing, Christine?
I'm doing great. How are you guys?
Great. So could you tell our listeners what you do for a living?
So I am currently a police officer with the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department. I'm a 22-year veteran, and right now I'm working with children to try to train them to become our future police officers. But I have a history of most of my career has been involved in investigations, including homicide, domestic violence, aggravated assault.
Wow. And is the crime rate pretty high in your jurisdiction?
It absolutely is high. It's too high here in Indianapolis, but we stay really, really busy. And yes, unfortunately, we have a really high homicide rate here.
Well, Christine, I recently was in Indianapolis, and I had been there years ago in the 80s, in the early 80s, and then I was there for CrimeCon recently, and I was actually pretty impressed with how the downtown Indianapolis area was. I mean, it was active. There was a lot of things going on. They had built so many new things, and it was really kind of a vibrant city, and that was a lot different than when I experienced it before. And that seems to cut against this whole high crime situation there. Why do you think that is?
Well, I tell you, the way our city is set up, downtown is probably the safest part of Indianapolis. The crime rate, is really low down there as far as crimes against person. They're low. And the way that we have the city set up, with a lot of the hotels and the sporting events and shopping, you can all walk from, every place you want to go downtown. So once you get settled in, you can pretty much walk. And then as you get north, south, east, and west in the city, you will come upon pockets of those parts of the city that are really high crime. And then as you get farther from that area, they become nicer again. So, I always tell people that downtown Indianapolis is by far probably the safest part of the entire city.
Well, I felt that way when I was there.
Well, good.
Anyway, I just want people to know that Indianapolis is a nice city, and there's certainly wonderful people living there, including yourself. And I'm very happy that I was able to help and host CrimeCon there. It was a wonderful event, so many great people, and including yourself. So let's get into the case now. The purpose of this podcast, as you might be aware, is to actually bring the listeners behind police lines. So you're the perfect opportunity here to explain to the listeners what actually happens behind the scenes in police investigations, how it affects the investigators, how the cases come in, how you work them, and how they stay with you even after a long period of time.
Yes, that's a interesting concept. I think that I'm asked a lot about certain investigations and how they do affect us as investigators and how we go about our daily life and just how we touch people in the community and how ultimately they touch us.
Well, that's great. So why don't we jump right in and start? Can you please tell us what kind of case you've chosen as your best case for this podcast?
I'll tell you, I've had so many cases, so it was kind of difficult to narrow them down. But one of the best cases I had was a homicide investigation that I investigated over probably a 6-month period. And then during that time period, I still didn't have a victim. It came in, as a missing persons, but it came in from a jurisdiction, a small town just south of Indianapolis. And they came up to our, homicide unit asking for help because they felt like this missing person may have been killed in Indianapolis. So it was the first time that I had, investigated a homicide where I didn't have a body. And then I'm kind of getting it about 2 months later.
Wow. So who actually came to you? What jurisdiction?
So Johnson County Sheriff's Department, which is just a county that's south of Indianapolis, about 40 minutes south. It's kind of rural, a lot of farmland down there. They came up and said that they had a report of a missing person, but that he had been missing for a couple months, and they had gotten some information that he had been up in Indianapolis, probably the last day that anybody had seen or heard from him. So they came up and kind of briefed me on what they had, and I had not been in homicide very long at that point, so it was kind of doing things a little bit backwards. But I was really intrigued by it because they believed that he had been killed in Indianapolis, and I had not really been convinced as I was starting to gather information. Like I said, it was a missing persons. They came up and said he had done some work in Indianapolis with another gentleman, so they kind of gave me the players that were involved, a buddy of his that worked for the victim, and said that they'd been up in Indianapolis doing some work, and that the victim had said that he was going to be going down to Kentucky after they completed the work. And So they were up here in Indianapolis, and like I said, he said he was going to Kentucky, and then that was the last that anybody ever heard or saw from him. So his son made a missing persons report, and as the Johnson County detectives started investigating, they figured out Indy was the last spot. So I started really the investigation after talking to the Johnson County detectives, kind of re-interviewing the people that they talked to. I thought it was important that I went down to where the victim lived, which I said was about 40 minutes south of Indianapolis and in a rural area, and he kind of owned a big piece of land. So I kind of walked the land and tried to get a little bit of feeling of what the victim was about. He was an older gentleman, and he kind of kept to himself. He had a son that obviously was very worried, and I had learned from the detectives that they had brought out some cadaver dogs to do the property because they just didn't know where he was. And so I went down there, just tried to get a little bit of a feel because, like I said, I'm getting this a couple months later, which is not something that I was used to. I usually get the scene, right when it happens, and I usually have a body, and this is 2 months later, and I have neither. So I just kind of wanted to learn about the victim a little bit.
I have a quick question. So this obviously is a very unusual case for you to start. And as a former prosecutor, I certainly would have been a little bewildered about how to begin a case without a body or without really any evidence of foul play. Was part of your goal when you were working the case to decide whether or not there was actually a homicide or any crime, or whether the guy just, I don't know, kind of ran away from home?
Yeah, there was, I was really intrigued by it because I think they caught me at a time where I was kind of in between homicides. And, I gave them the opportunity, professional courtesy, to come up and kind of tell me what they had. But they were convinced off the bat that it happened in Indianapolis. And so I, obviously became really intrigued and wanted to jump on it as quickly as I could in case it did happen in Indy. But yeah, I just, it just was really intriguing. It was just something that I hadn't been exposed to. And they weren't convinced. They were convinced there had been foul play, but there hadn't been any indicators that there had been foul play other than no one could find him. So I just kind of, it was one of those deals where I didn't feel a lot of pressure because we didn't know where he was and we didn't even know if he was alive or dead. And so I just kind of kept an open mind and was extremely intrigued by it. So I just kind of jumped in.
Christine, had anybody from the other jurisdiction, from the sheriff's office, had they done any, I'm not sure exactly what time period this was, but had they done anything like looked for cell phone records to see where his cell phone pinged last?
Yeah, they had. And that led them to Indianapolis. So they had done a pretty good extensive interviews with some of the coworkers that he had worked with. And they had found out that he had been up to Indianapolis. I think it was like June 15th. And they did some phone records. And it pinged right in Indianapolis. And so, they had interviewed some people there, and then I went back and kind of re-interviewed. So I knew that he was in Indianapolis June 15th and that he had dropped his buddy off that had worked with him during the day. And his buddy had said, yeah, he was dropping me off. And then he told me he was going down to Kentucky to visit a woman and that he would be back in a few days because they had another work project to do. And then
were they ever able to determine if he actually went down to Kentucky?
Yeah, so they went down to Kentucky. They did go down to Kentucky, and no one had seen him down there. So they had put missing flyers out, missing person flyers out. He had owned a cabin down there, and so they had gone down and checked to see if he had been at the cabin, and the neighbors had said no, he hadn't been. So they had really done a pretty thorough investigation as far as trying to locate him, and we're coming up with a dead end, and the bank records indicated that his last transaction was in Indianapolis. So after getting all that information, I kind of thought, well, hell, maybe he was killed here.
All right, so there was no information that he actually went to Kentucky. So did that put suspicion on the guy that said, oh, they went off to Kentucky and said they'd be coming back in a few days?
Well, it did. So I read through the interview that the detectives had done, and he seemed, they didn't find him really much as a suspect. They really believed that it was the last one that he saw. I was a little bit more kind of suspicious about it just because I didn't have any other leads, so I felt like he was probably the best one, and I went and re-interviewed him, and he was just a little bit sketchy, but he wasn't overly, he didn't provide a lot of information, and I didn't have a lot to go on other than he was the last one to see him alive. So once I interviewed him, it kind of stalled a little bit. It was kind of like, I walked out of the interview going, well, he still is the last person that saw him. I put as much pressure on him as I could, not really knowing much. And then the investigation kind of stalled. And about a week later, the victim's truck was found in Kentucky in like a wooded area, abandoned in a wooded area. So
that's a twist.
Yeah. So, I mean, it kind of stalled. And like I said, it wasn't, what we typically call a hot case. I had probably gotten another murder, in between all this time, but I was contacted that the truck, had been found in Kentucky. So I had Kentucky authorities transported up here to our crime lab because we have better facilities than what Johnson County had. And I had, DNA and blood samples and things I taken, and we had the cadaver dogs come back out. And the cadaver dog was able to hit on the bed of the truck.
Let's just back up for 1 second when you're talking about cadaver dogs. We have some very savvy, sophisticated listeners, but for those who might be new to true crime or to crime, they may have heard of bomb sniffing dogs and seen them at the airport, but maybe they're not familiar with cadaver dogs. So what are they trained to do?
Well, they're trained to smell. And what's interesting too, Francie, is that this is the first time that I had used the dogs. So this was all a new kind of great experience for me. And so I called these guys out and said, hey, this is what I have. We have a missing person. And they kind of came out and told me that they're trained to smell the scent of death, for lack of a better word, and for people. And so, they came out and they did their thing. And they said, the dog will lay down, if they sense anything. And absolutely, the dog hit on 4 different spots around the truck, in the bed, and then kind of on the side door, where I thought that I saw some blood. So we took some blood samples there. And so when they were done doing their thing, the dog was able to tell me that there had been a body, in the back of this truck. So, that highlighted, obviously.
So the case now moves from a missing person to a probably dead person.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then you're thinking, okay, well, this body's down in Kentucky where the truck was found. So I kind of, retraced it, and then it became, well, maybe this isn't going to be my case now, But I was still so intrigued by it and inspired by it that I got with the Kentucky authorities, and I think before I even had the truck, transferred up to Indianapolis, they did a search of the area where it was, and I gave them the information that we had as far as the missing person, and they said that they just found this truck, and that literally just looked like it had been parked there and abandoned in a wooded area, kind of off a street. So there we go. So we're kind of. Wow. And what I did learn, and I think I failed to mention, was the Johnson County detectives, there were a bunch of tools that were in the back of the truck when we interviewed one of the witnesses, or the last person that saw him. And of course, the tools are gone. And so now we know we have a body. And so time kind of goes on a little bit more, and I kind of start just,
Well, wait a minute. We know we have a body?
Yes.
What do you mean?
Well, we know we have a body based on the cadaver dogs.
Well, you don't have the body,
we don't
but
have
you
the
know
body,
a
but we have a
body
scent.
exists. I'm sorry.
Right.
I thought you said somehow that you actually found the body. Okay.
No.
So,
When the cadaver dogs hit, I thought maybe it's down in Kentucky, but no luck there. So really all we have is we don't have a body. We have a scent of a body.
yeah, we have the indication that that there is actually a body. But what's interesting, this is a good time to talk about it, is for our listeners, there's actually been a number of very successful prosecutions for homicide, and when there's no body found ever, and they're called no body homicides. And actually in my unit, in the behavioral analysis unit, we collected data on this, and we linked up prosecutors from cases that were successful in prosecuting no body homicides with other prosecutors that hadn't yet done it, so that they could actually share information, talk about the different motions that are filed, talk about the different pitfalls in the cases, and actually do a very good job at creating a situation where they could maximize the chance of getting a confession, even though they couldn't yet recover the body. They couldn't find the body.
Right.
Well, that's such an interesting point, Jim. And Christine, one of the things we've promised our listeners that we think is unique to this podcast, or different from most other podcasts, is talking about the effects that these kinds of investigations have on the cops and prosecutors. So what I'd like to know is, you said something earlier about, well, there was just a missing person, no body, no necessarily any crime noted, so you didn't feel a lot of pressure. Well, now you've got a cadaver dog hitting on a truck. You've got the man's abandoned truck in Kentucky. How does this sort of change your stress level and your emotions as you are investigating the case?
Well, I think I think the stress level goes up, but I really kind of get just excited because I'm like, this case is so unique, and each new thing with the dogs and the dogs scenting this body, or, that we don't have or we can't see. We still don't know, where he is he alive? Is he not? And so I think the stress level, it wasn't too high yet. I was very, very excited about trying to run with this case about as quickly as I possibly could to see where it would lead. So I think that, there still wasn't a lot of stress yet because I wasn't convinced of where it had happened yet. And if I was getting any type of stress, it was almost that I was working too hard on it for a case that we don't know that our county has. So I hadn't gone to our prosecutor yet and talked to them about anything, because it would have been premature and they would have told me to, come back when you have something solid. So I think I was just really, really excited about where this case was going to lead me.
All right. And where did it lead you?
So again, we talk with Kentucky and they don't find a body, and then it kind of lapses again. I go back, I try to interview more people, and then we get a break. I get a video back from a pawn shop in Indianapolis with the selling the victim's tools that were in the back of the truck. And
In Indianapolis?
Yes, in Indianapolis. So I see the video, and it is the last person that saw the victim with another gentleman, and they're pawning the victim's tools at a pawn shop. So
Wow. Can I just ask you a question though? How far is Kentucky, where this truck was found, from Indianapolis?
probably about 2.5 hours,
Okay, so not too far. It's not
No,
a
not
huge
too far.
amount of.
and not
Okay.
far from
I
where
ju-
the victim lived. Probably about an hour and a half, hour
Got it.
and a half, hour and 45 minutes. Yeah.
All right, because I have a feeling that might come into play. But go ahead. So now you actually have a video of this guy who was the last person to report seeing him alive, the one who told us that he was going to Kentucky. And now he
Yes.
is on a video with another person pawning the victim's tools.
The victim's tools. So
Wow.
I get the
Which can be
video.
quite
Yeah.
valuable, Christine. Tools like that can be quite valuable.
Oh, absolutely valuable. And, through the investigation, because that's what my victim did, is he did a lot of outside work, he had a lot of tools. And at some point I had learned, that a lot of these tools were not there. They weren't at his house. They weren't at his buddy's house up in Indianapolis. Like, they're gone. So once I had told our pawn unit, hey, keep an eye on, if anything comes through with some tools, let me know. And they did. And now
Wow.
we're talking 3 weeks later. So now I'm woke back up kind of and excited again about this case and watching this video of the first initial person that both Johnson County and I had interviewed, along with another man. And what I learned there was the other man was in jail down in Johnson County, so on a different charge. So I go down
Wow.
and talk to him and interview him, and he tries to say that he didn't really know, he thought it was his buddy's tools, that he didn't know the victim, just kind of really distanced himself. But he does tell me that the conversation that he had with Charles, which was the last man that saw him, he had been acting a little funky, back in June, saying some stuff went down on the property, but he wouldn't give me any more specifics than that. He just said he was real kind of nervous about it. But, and I'm trying to get more, I'm all excited, but he wouldn't give up anything more. So from there, we had a confidential informant get wired up and go and try to talk to Charles about it. And we did some surveillance and was outside his house for several hours, and we didn't get anything from there. So then I decided, okay, well, I'm going to go back and I'm going to interview Charles again, and I'm going to lock him up for stealing these tools. It's going to be a weak charge, but I'm going to try that. And I go back to try to find him, and he is gone. He's gone. He's left the city of Indianapolis. And so...
Well, Christine, this gives me a chance to use one of my favorite lines when I was a prosecutor.
Okay.
And let me see if this appeals to you. I would tell a jury in a case like this, if this were my case, at this moment when I'm talking about how this guy fled after being questioned, it reminds me of this quote. The guilty man flees where no one pursues, while the righteous stands bold as the lion.
Absolutely.
Am I dead on? I'm assuming he was not the righteous man standing bold as the lion.
Right. You're absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. So I try to interview. That's great. I go back and I interview Charlie's family, and I'm like, hey, what's his cell number? I'm trying to get his records to find out where he is. And I found a sister that said, I think he's up in Wisconsin. I think he met a girl online, and he's up in Wisconsin. So we get his phone records, and sure enough, he's up in Wisconsin. So now we're going 7 hours north of Indianapolis. I get in touch with the Wisconsin authorities and say, hey, I'm looking for this guy. I don't have a warrant. I'm hoping that he'll come talk to me. Do you have any idea where he is? So we drive the 7-8 hours up to Tomahawk, Wisconsin. And
Tomahawk.
Yeah. And we get with those guys and we brief them on this case, and we go, and he's kind of in a trailer in kind of a remote area. And we grab him up. We surround the trailer. The girlfriend that he had met online opens up the door, and I'm like, hey, is Charles in there? And she's like, yeah. And he comes out, and I tell him, I say, hey, you're not under arrest right now, but I need to speak with you. And lucky again, he decides, he'll talk to me again. So we take him to the police station there in Tomahawk, and they're all very helpful and excited because nothing like this, has happened up there. So, and we interview him for hours and hours and hours. Me and my partner go back and forth. The Johnson County detectives are up there. We're exhausted, and we're trying to, get this thing, talk to him. And probably about 5 or 6 hours into the interview, my partner goes in there one last time, and he finally gives it up. And what he says is he was working with the victim, that they had been up to Indianapolis working, and so all that kind of fit, and that they had driven back down to George's property. And while they were down there, I guess Charles was going to spend the night down there because they had another project the next day. Supposedly George made a move on him, which I don't really believe, but that's what he said. He said he kind of made a sexual advance toward him, and he shot him. And then he put him in the back of George's truck and was kind of, didn't know what to do. And he ends up burying him on his own property, which ironically, the Johnson County had taken their cadaver dogs down and walked the property, and they had not hit on the victim. So I am up in Tomahawk, Wisconsin, and he kind of draws me a map of George's land. And I'd been semi-familiar because I'd walked it. And he drew me and told me where the body was. And so we sent more authorities down there, and damn if George wasn't on his own property the entire time.
Wow. Well, it's interesting because when you first started telling me this story about this case and you started describing the victim, and this is obviously nothing against this victim, it reminded me of the circumstances surrounding John McLemore in the Serial podcast, S-Town. That he was a kind of a character, and he lived on a big piece of property, and he ended up dying in this whole thing. But in my mind, it kind of reminded me of that. But the difference was in that case that I was thinking John actually was sort of a little bit of a pariah in the area, and he was very sort of eccentric, but he also was very manipulative, and he was clearly gay, yet he didn't seemed to want to engage in relationships with guys who were gay, but he seemed to surround himself with younger guys who he could sort of, satisfy, their need to get work and so forth and so on. And he could help them that way. And he built relationships with these guys. And it really appeared to me that he was manipulating these guys who were not gay, and he wanted to control their lives.
Right,
but
right.
I wonder, did this defendant say anything more about this? Was this just out of the blue, or was there something that led up to him, quote, making a pass at him?
It's interesting because early on when I had talked to Charles the first time, he had told me in the interview that George had owed him some money. And I thought, okay, maybe that's a baby motive at this point, that he owed him some money and he killed him. But, he was so exhausted like we were. And then all of a sudden, when my partner went in and she got real, real close to him and just put her hand on his arm and just said, you know what, it's okay. It's okay. And he started to break down and cry. And then he just said, I shot him. He kind of came on to me. I don't do those types of things. And the minute we got him to finally say that, and then we went straight to where's the body, then that was it. He didn't tell us another thing, not one other thing. Once he gave us the diagram, he was done. It was the weirdest thing because he was exhausted and then he was crying and then he was, and I don't know if he was sitting there because for probably about 3 hours into the interview, I'm like, we're going to get him. Like I felt like we're going to get him. We just got to continue to work it and work it and work it. But he was getting exhausted and he was getting tired and I felt like he was going to come up off of it. And we were just trying to figure out the different ways to make that happen. And once he finally got it off his chest and he confessed to it and he drew a picture of where the bodies were, then he was done. Absolutely done. No more information. None. And we took him home. We drove in the car for 8 hours with him. He never said a word.
So, Christine, I have a question. Obviously, at this point, you don't know whether he's telling you the truth about the reason for the murder, but it does seem a little suspicious. I'm not saying it couldn't be the reason for the murder. People have these terrible motives all of the time, but it seems a little suspicious to me. The guy just makes a pass at him, he shoots him, decides to bury him, and then, oh, by the way, yeah, I'm going to rob him too. I mean, did you ever find out whether there was an actually different motive, or were you sort of stuck with the one he gave you?
We were absolutely stuck with the one that he gave us, and then he ended up taking a plea. It never even went to trial because I wanted to know. I was never really comfortable with the complete story, but he just, he never wavered. He never wavered. We never got any other information that it was any other way than what he said, and just kind of stuck with it, which, kind of sucks because it's, we have an ending, but I don't have all the specifics that I would like.
Well, I think that's one of the frustrating things about being a cop or a prosecutor in the system is that sometimes while we close the case, we get a conviction or a plea, it doesn't necessarily mean you get all of the answers. And I think that why question is one of those that stumped me for a long time. I mean, through prosecuting child abuse cases, of course, you never get the answer to why. Or a child physical abuse case. I had parents once who had beaten their 12-month-old so badly they had broken 23 of his bones over just a period of a couple of months. Wow. And of course, you never hear really why. Certainly not, you never get a why that really satisfies you. So I'm interested in, you didn't really get a why. So why was this your best case?
Well, I think it was, best is kind of a relative in my brain. It was a best case personally because I had never had a case like this before. And I was learning some new things and I had networked and learned about these cadaver dogs. And I think that, I had literally walked over the body when I was down there. And it just kind of stuck with me in the fact that I kept working it. I kept working it when I had nothing, when it was 2.5 months old. And it just kind of showed me as an individual and as a detective that if you just continue to work it, you can get, some form of conclusion. You're not going to get all of your answers questioned and you're not going to get all your whys like you've said. But I think it really, it helped me grow as a detective and show that I have, the ability that if I just kind of keep fighting through it and talking to people, like I'm really intrigued with interviews and interrogations and how we kind of, went at him and how we had to try so many different angles and how you just kind of kept doing it as exhausted. And it led me to, southern Indiana to northern Wisconsin. And I just hadn't experienced those types of things. So when I look back on it, I think I really grew as a person and as a detective after that case.
That's great. And, you raised an issue, so I want to explore it a little tiny bit more because we're running short on time. But you said 3 to 4 hours into it, you sort of knew that we got him. And there's a lot of talk out there about situations in which there are false confessions. And of course, nobody in law enforcement wants a false confession. And in this case, it's not an issue, right? Because he actually drew you a map and led you to where the body was. So right. This could not be that. But when you do say we got him, it's not that you got him to say something he didn't do. What you're saying is you felt like you were getting closer to the truth, like he was going to actually disclose the truth.
Yeah,
right?
We established a relationship. We figured out how to put him in a position to feel comfortable to tell us because he was almost really very shy. He was very limited in what he was saying. We had to fill in the gaps a lot for the questions because he just didn't elaborate on many things. And it just got to the point where I think, we figured out how to put him in a position to feel comfortable enough or safe enough to tell us. So that's kind of what I mean by, we got him. We just kind of kept working him. And it wasn't we never had to get loud. We never had to, it was just a conversation that lasted forever. And he just,
Right.
finally came up off of it. And it was, it was an interesting case for me and experience.
Yeah, but by working him, you mean continue to build rapport and try to use
Build
rationalizations.
rapport and
Right.
kind of learn a little bit more about his life. And, I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for people, even the ones that are sitting across from you that have done bad things. And I think, early on into the interview, he felt bad. And this was a huge, huge weight that was going to come up off of his shoulders if we could get him in a position to feel comfortable to say it.
Wow. Well, it's obvious that your tenacity and your determination actually ended up solving this case and bringing justice to a guy whose life was taken away. And that is a wonderful thing. You're a hero. We appreciate you doing that. And we certainly appreciate you coming on to Best Case, Worst Case.
Well, I appreciate you guys having me. I really enjoyed it. And I enjoy your guys' podcast for sure.
Great. Well, you have a podcast too, don't you?
I do. It's called the Mannina Files, and it is on iTunes and Google Play. And it's just, it's my cases of my entire career. We delve into the specifics and everything that comes with investigating all sorts of cases in 22 years of law enforcement.
That's awesome. And so if our listeners want to hear about the great cases that Christine Mannina has worked in her capacity as a police officer in Indianapolis, then you should definitely check out the Mannina Files. Well, thank you for listening. And for now, we're signing off on Best Case, Worst Case. Best Case, Worst Case is a TextG production. Produced by Jim Clementi at Empire Studios, LA. Engineered and edited by Terrell Parham. Music by Sinbal Sumas. Hosted by Wondery.
You can subscribe to Best Case, Worst Case on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, or your favorite listening app.